A 79-year-old woman lies dying in a hospital room. Her pancreatic cancer too far gone to treat. When the new doctor walks in to examine her, something about his smile, his voice, his gentle hands makes her heart stop. 36 years ago, she lost her 7-year-old son to the streets of Chicago, and this doctor is exactly the age her Charlie would be now. Is her dying mind playing tricks on her, or is the impossible about to become real? Welcome to Story Theater. Take your seat, silence your phones and get ready to enjoy the story. The autumn light fell weak through the window of room 412 at Cleveland Clinic Cancer Center. Margaret Miller sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her hands folded in her lap. The paper gown felt rough against her skin. She was 79 years old, and the doctors had just told her that the pancreatic cancer had spread too far. There was no surgery that could save her now. No treatment that would push back the darkness creeping through her body. She did not cry. Tears had dried up years ago, back when real loss had carved her hollow. This diagnosis was only a clock ticking down, telling her what she already knew in her bones. She had been tired for so long. Outside the window, the trees were turning. Red and gold leaves trembled in the October wind. The sky was gray and low, pressing down on the city. Margaret watched a single leaf detach from a branch and spiral down, disappearing from view. She thought of all the autumns she had lived through, all the seasons that had come and gone while she searched. The door opened softly. A nurse stepped in, her shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. She was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes and dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She carried a clipboard against her chest. "Mrs. Miller?" the nurse said gently. "How are you feeling?" Margaret turned her head slowly. "Tired," she said. Her voice came out thin, like paper. The nurse nodded. She had heard that word 1,000 times in this building. "I know. We'll make you as comfortable as we can." She glanced at her clipboard. "I wanted to let you know, there's been a change in the schedule. The doctor who was supposed to oversee your care had a family emergency. We've assigned someone else to your case." Margaret said nothing. It did not matter who the doctor was. One white coat was the same as another at this point. "He's very good," the nurse continued, trying to sound encouraging. "He just transferred here from Johns Hopkins last month. Everyone says he's excellent with patients." Before Margaret could respond, there was a knock on the door. It opened again, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair beginning to show gray at the temples. He wore a white coat over a blue shirt, a stethoscope draped around his neck. His face was clean-shaven, and his eyes were a soft brown. "Good afternoon," he said. His voice was warm and steady. "I'm Dr. Michael Parker. I'll be taking care of you during your stay here." Margaret looked at him. Something flickered in her chest, faint and strange. She could not name it. It was not fear, not quite hope. It was something older, something buried deep. The doctor moved closer to her bedside. He held out his hand. Margaret took it slowly. His grip was firm but gentle, the way a person holds something fragile. His skin was warm. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Miller," he said, looking directly into her eyes. There was no pity in his gaze, only attention. He saw her as a person, not just a dying body. "Nice to meet you too, Dr. Parker," Margaret said quietly. She heard the name clearly. Parker. It echoed in her mind, bouncing against memories she had carried for decades. The doctor pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, leaning forward slightly. "I've read through your file," he said. "I know this is a difficult time. I want you to know that my priority is keeping you comfortable and making sure you're not in pain. We're going to take this one day at a time." Margaret nodded. She studied his face, the shape of his jaw, the way his eyebrows curved slightly upward at the inner corners, the small scar on his left cheek, barely visible, the way he tilted his head when he listened. It was all so familiar. Her heart began to beat faster, a flutter she had not felt in years. She told herself it was only the illness, the weakness, the medication. But the feeling did not go away. Dr. Parker asked her questions. How was her pain? Was she sleeping? Did she have family nearby? Margaret answered in short sentences, her mind only half present. She kept watching him. The way his hands moved when he spoke. The way he smiled, small and careful, as if he did not want to intrude on her sorrow. "Do you have anyone who can stay with you?" he asked. "Family or friends?" Margaret shook her head. "No. My husband passed many years ago. I have no children." That last sentence caught in her throat. It was the lie she had told for so long that it almost felt true. Almost. Dr. Parker's face softened. "I'm sorry," he said. "That must be lonely." "It is," Margaret whispered. He stood, placing a hand briefly on her shoulder. "I'll check on you again this evening," he said. "If you need anything at all, just press the call button. Someone will come right away." "Thank you, Doctor," Margaret said. He nodded and walked to the door. Before he left, he turned back and gave her a small smile. Then he was gone, and the room felt colder. The nurse adjusted Margaret's pillows and checked her foreline. "He's nice, isn't he?" she said brightly. "You're in good hands." Margaret did not answer. She stared at the closed door. The hours passed slowly. Lunch came on a tray, but Margaret barely touched it. Her stomach could not hold much anymore. She drank some water and lay back against the pillows, exhausted. As the sun set, the room filled with shadows. The hallway outside grew quieter. Visiting hours ended. Footsteps faded. Margaret lay awake, her mind turning over and over. Dr. Michael Parker. That name, that face, that voice. She thought of her son, Charlie, 7 years old when she last saw him. Bright eyes and messy hair and a laugh that filled the whole house. He would be 43 now. The same age as this doctor, maybe. Perhaps a year or two different. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself imagine. What if Charlie had grown up? What if he had become a doctor, kind and capable? Someone who helped people at the end of their lives? What would he look like now? Would his face have matured into strong lines? Would his hands have learned to heal? She opened her eyes and shook her head. It was foolish. Charlie was gone, lost to the world 36 years ago. He was not coming back. This doctor was just a stranger with a familiar name and a kind smile. Nothing more. But the ache in her chest would not stop. When full dark had fallen, Margaret reached for the small notebook on her bedside table. It was old, the cover worn soft from years of handling. She had kept a diary since the day Charlie disappeared. Every thought, every memory, every flicker of hope had been written down in these pages. She opened it to a blank page and picked up the pen. Her hand trembled. The letters came out shaky and uneven. October 15th. 2023. Cleveland Clinic. They told me today that I am dying. I already knew. The pain has been growing for months. I am not afraid. She paused, the pen hovering above the paper. A new doctor came today. His name is Michael Parker. Something about him made my heart remember. His eyes, his voice, the way he moved. I keep thinking he must be the same age as my Charlie would be now. 43, maybe 44. Margaret's vision blurred. She blinked, and a tear fell onto the page, smudging the ink. I know it is only my mind playing tricks. I know Charlie is gone. But for a moment, just a moment, I let myself wonder. What if? What if the world is not as cruel as I thought? What if miracles are real? She closed the notebook and set it aside. Her body felt heavy, sinking into the mattress. The morphine drip hummed quietly in the corner. Outside, the city lights blinked on, one by one, pushing back the night. Margaret closed her eyes and whispered into the darkness. "Charlie," she said softly. "If you're out there somewhere, I hope you're happy. I hope you found a good life. I hope you forgive me." The only answer was the beep of the heart monitor, steady and alone. The town of Jackson, Michigan, had seen better days. Factories that once hummed with 3 shifts of workers now stood empty, their windows broken and dark. The streets downtown were quieter than they used to be. Storefronts closed one by one, replaced by hand-painted signs that said "for lease" in fading letters. The young people left for Detroit or Chicago, chasing jobs that Jackson could no longer provide. But life went on. Families still lived in the small houses with front porches and chain-link fences. Children still played in the yards after school. On Sunday mornings, church bells still rang across the neighborhoods. People held on to what they had, even as the world around them changed. The Miller house sat on Maple Street, a narrow road lined with oak trees. It was a modest 2-story home with white siding and green shutters. The paint was peeling in places, and the porch steps creaked when you walked up them, but it was home. A rusted swing set stood in the backyard, and a vegetable garden took up the sunny corner by the fence. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and toast. It was early morning, the sky still gray with the last edges of night. In the kitchen, Margaret Miller stood at the counter, her hands moving quickly as she made sandwiches. She was 36 years old, with light brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and tired lines around her eyes. She wore a faded blue robe over her nightgown and slippers with worn soles. She spread peanut butter on bread, then added jelly, then pressed another slice on top. She cut the sandwich diagonally and wrapped it in wax paper. She did this every morning. One sandwich for her husband, David. One for her son, Charlie. The rhythm of it was comforting, like a prayer. From upstairs came the sound of footsteps, heavy and slow. David was awake. Margaret glanced at the clock on the wall. 4:40 in the morning. Right on time. David was always on time. He had to be. The first bus route started at 5:30, and he needed to get to the depot by 5:15 to check the vehicle and sign in. David came down the stairs, his work boots thumping on each step. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and solid, with dark hair starting to thin on top. He wore the uniform of Great Lakes Transit, dark blue pants and a light blue shirt with his name stitched over the pocket. His face was rough with stubble. He had not shaved yet. He poured himself coffee from the pot and leaned against the refrigerator, drinking slowly. He watched his wife work, her hands quick and efficient. After 15 years of marriage, they had learned to move around each other without words. They knew each other's routines, each other's silences. Margaret placed the wrapped sandwiches into a brown paper bag along with an apple and a small bag of chips. She folded the top of the bag twice and set it on the counter. David finished his coffee and rinsed the cup in the sink. He picked up the lunch bag and tucked it under his arm. Then he walked over to Margaret and kissed the top of her head. "See you tonight," he said quietly. "Be safe," she replied. He nodded and headed for the door. Margaret heard the jingle of his keys, the creak of the door opening, the sound of his boots on the porch. Then the truck engine turned over, rough and loud in the quiet morning. The headlights swept across the kitchen window as he backed out of the driveway. Then he was gone, and the house was silent again. Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug and stared out the window at the slowly brightening sky. This was her favorite time of day. The quiet before Charlie woke up. The stillness before the world demanded things from her. She thought about the bills sitting in the basket by the telephone. The electric bill, the water bill. The payment for David's truck. Money was always tight. David's salary from the transit company was not much, and Margaret's part-time job at the grocery store barely helped. But they managed. They always managed. She finished her coffee and stood, washing the mug and setting it in the dish rack to dry. Then she went upstairs to wake Charlie. His room was small, with a single bed pushed against the wall and a dresser covered with toy cars and action figures. Posters of superheroes hung crooked on the walls. Charlie was buried under his blankets, only the top of his head visible. His hair was dark and messy, sticking up in all directions. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and gently shook his shoulder. He groaned and pulled the blanket over his face. She pulled it back down and smiled. Charlie opened his eyes slowly. They were brown, like his father's, bright and curious even when he was half asleep. He was 7 years old, small for his age, with skinny arms and legs and a gap where his front tooth used to be. "Is Dad already gone?" he asked. "Left 10 minutes ago." Charlie's face fell. Margaret ruffled his hair and told him to get dressed. Breakfast would be ready in 10 minutes. She went back downstairs to make breakfast. She scrambled eggs and toasted bread and poured orange juice into Charlie's favorite cup, the one with the cartoon dinosaur on it. By the time Charlie came down, dressed in jeans and a red shirt, the food was on the table. He climbed into his chair and started eating, his legs swinging under the table. They ate in comfortable silence. The morning light was growing stronger now, filling the kitchen with a soft glow. Margaret watched her son eat and felt a deep contentment settle in her chest. These small moments, these ordinary mornings, this was what mattered. After breakfast, Charlie went to brush his teeth while Margaret packed his lunch. Another sandwich, a juice box, a bag of pretzels. She tucked a napkin with a smiley face drawn on it into the bag, something she had done since he started school. When Charlie came back downstairs, his backpack slung over one shoulder, Margaret handed him the lunch bag. They walked together to the front door. The bus would pick him up at the corner in 5 minutes. Margaret helped him with his jacket and zipped it up to his chin. She kissed his forehead and told him she loved him. Charlie said it back, then ran down the porch steps and down the sidewalk, his backpack bouncing against his back. Margaret stood in the doorway and watched him go. The morning air was cool and fresh, smelling faintly of wet earth and new grass. The sun was climbing higher now, bright and warm. Spring was finally coming. She thought about the rest of her day. Laundry to fold, dishes to wash, a shift at the grocery store from noon to 4. Then home to start dinner before David got back. It was the same routine every day, predictable and safe. And that was enough. That was everything. Margaret closed the door and went back inside. She did not know that in 3 weeks, Her husband would be dead. She did not know that she would lose her son. She did not know that the peaceful life she was living would shatter into pieces too small to ever put back together. All she knew was this moment, this morning, this quiet house that smelled like coffee and toast. And for now, that was all she needed to know. Later that evening, when David came home, he was tired. His shoulders sagged, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Driving a bus for 10 hours was hard on the body. But when he walked through the door and saw Charlie sitting on the living room floor playing with his toy cars, his face softened. Charlie jumped up and ran to him. David caught him and lifted him up, even though his back ached. He set him down and ruffled his hair. Then Charlie grabbed his father's wrist, staring at the old silver Timex watch with its scratched face and worn leather band. It had belonged to David's father, and before that, his grandfather. It was the only thing of value David owned. Charlie touched the glass with one finger, tracing the hands as they moved. The second hand ticked steadily. The minute hand crept forward. The hour hand barely seemed to move at all. "Dad, are the hour hand and the minute hand fighting?" Charlie asked, his small face serious. David laughed, a deep warm sound. He knelt down so he was eye level with his son. "Fighting? Why would they be fighting?" "Because they keep moving away from each other. Like they don't want to be together." David smiled and explained that they were not fighting but working together. The minute hand moved fast because it had a small job, counting the minutes. The hour hand moved slow because it had a big job, counting the hours. They needed each other to tell the time. Charlie thought about this, his expression thoughtful. "So they're a team?" "Exactly. A team." Charlie smiled, satisfied with the answer. He let go of David's wrist and went back to his toys. David stood and walked into the kitchen where Margaret was stirring a pot on the stove. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. The steam rose from the pot, warm and fragrant. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The house was warm and full of the sounds of family. This was happiness, simple and fragile and real. And for now, it was theirs. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in May. Margaret was folding laundry in the living room, the television playing quietly in the background. Sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the carpet where she sat. A basket of clean clothes rested beside her, and she worked methodically, matching socks and smoothing wrinkles from shirts. Charlie was at school. David was on his route. The house was peaceful. When the telephone rang, she did not think anything of it. She stood and walked to the kitchen, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was professional, clipped, careful. It belonged to a woman from Great Lakes Transit, someone Margaret had never met. "Is this Mrs. Margaret Miller?" "Yes, this is she." There was a pause. In that single second of silence, Margaret's heart began to beat faster. She gripped the phone tighter. "Mrs. Miller, there's been an accident. Your husband's bus was involved in a collision at the intersection of Michigan Avenue and 4th Street. He's been taken to Foot Hospital. You need to come right away." The words did not make sense at first. They floated in the air, disconnected from reality. Margaret opened her mouth but no sound came out. "Mrs. Miller? Are you there?" "Yes," Margaret whispered. "I'm coming." She hung up the phone and stood frozen in the kitchen. Her hands were shaking. The sunlight that had felt warm moments ago now seemed harsh and glaring. She grabbed her purse and keys from the counter and ran to the car. The drive to the hospital was a blur. She did not remember getting on the road or passing through traffic lights. Her mind kept looping the same thought over and over. "He's okay. He has to be okay. It's just a precaution. They always take people to the hospital after accidents. He's fine." But her hands would not stop shaking on the steering wheel. Foot Hospital sat on the east side of town, a sprawling brick building surrounded by parking lots. Margaret pulled into the first space she saw and ran toward the emergency entrance. The automatic doors slid open too slowly. She pushed through them and nearly collided with a nurse carrying a clipboard. "My husband," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "David Miller. He was in a bus accident. They brought him here." The nurse's face softened. She set down her clipboard and placed a hand on Margaret's arm. "Come with me." They walked down a long hallway with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The smell of disinfectant burned Margaret's nose. Doors lined both sides of the corridor, some open, some closed. She heard voices, beeping machines, the squeak of wheels on linoleum. The nurse stopped outside a room and turned to face Margaret. Her expression was gentle but sad, the look of someone who had delivered bad news many times before. "Mrs. Miller, I need you to prepare yourself." Margaret's knees went weak. She leaned against the wall. "Is he?" "The doctors did everything they could." "I'm so sorry." The world tilted. Margaret felt the floor shift beneath her feet. She shook her head, her breath coming in short gasps. "No, no, that's not possible. He left this morning. He's coming home tonight. We're having meatloaf for dinner." The nurse said nothing. She just stood there, her hand still on Margaret's arm, steady and kind. Margaret pushed past her and into the room. David lay on a bed in the center of the room, covered with a white sheet up to his chest. His eyes were closed. His face was pale, too pale, and there was a cut on his forehead crusted with dried blood. His hands rested at his sides, still and lifeless. Margaret walked to the bed slowly, as if moving through water. She reached out and took his hand. It was cold. The warmth was gone. The life was gone. She sank into the chair beside the bed and held his hand in both of hers. Tears streamed down her face, hot and relentless. She could not speak. She could not think. She could only sit there, holding the hand of the man who had kissed her head that morning before leaving for work. A doctor came in eventually, a young man with kind eyes and a white coat. He explained what had happened. A delivery truck had run a red light at the intersection. The bus had no time to stop. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. David had died on impact. There was no pain. It was fast. Margaret heard the words, but they meant nothing. Fast. No pain. What did any of that matter? He was still gone. The hospital gave her forms to sign. Papers about the body. About the autopsy. About arrangements. She signed them without reading, her hand moving automatically across the pages. She did not know how she got home. She did not remember driving. But suddenly she was standing in her kitchen again, staring at the coffee pot David had used that morning. His mug was still in the dish rack. The lunch bag she had packed for him sat empty on the counter, brought back by someone from the transit company. Charlie came home on the school bus at 3 o'clock. Margaret met him at the door and knelt down, pulling him into her arms. She held him tight and told him that his father was gone. Charlie did not understand at first. He asked when Dad would be back. Margaret had to explain again, her voice breaking, that he was never coming back. Charlie cried then, his small body shaking against hers. Margaret held him and cried with him, and the house that had been so warm and full of life now felt cold and empty. The days that followed were a haze. There was a funeral. People came to the house with casseroles and sympathy cards. Margaret sat on the couch and nodded when they spoke, but she did not hear them. She was numb, moving through the world like a ghost. Great Lakes Transit sent a representative to the house a week after the accident. He was a middle-aged man in a cheap suit, carrying a briefcase. He sat at the kitchen table and explained the company's insurance policy. Because David had died in the line of duty, Margaret would receive a payout. $20,000. He slid the check across the table. Margaret stared at it. $20,000. As if money could replace a husband. As if a number on a piece of paper could fill the hole in her chest. She took the check without a word. The man offered his condolences again and left. Margaret deposited the money in the bank. She paid off the truck. She paid the mortgage ahead for 6 months. She bought groceries and new shoes for Charlie. But none of it mattered. The money sat in her account, useless and meaningless. It could not bring David back. It could not make Charlie stop asking when Dad was coming home. It could not make the house feel like a home again. 2 weeks after the funeral, Margaret woke up coughing. It was a deep, rattling cough that shook her whole body. She sat up in bed, gasping for air. Her chest hurt. Her throat was raw. She told herself it was just a cold. Grief did strange things to the body. She would be fine in a few days. But the cough did not go away. It got worse. Every morning she woke up drenched in sweat, the sheets clinging to her skin. Her temperature climbed. She felt weak, dizzy, unable to eat. Charlie asked if she was okay, and she lied and said yes. One morning she coughed so hard that blood appeared on the tissue she held to her mouth. She stared at the bright red stain, her heart pounding. That afternoon she drove to the clinic on the edge of town, leaving Charlie with a neighbor. The waiting room was crowded with people sneezing and coughing, mothers holding feverish children, old men reading newspapers. Margaret sat in a plastic chair and waited for her name to be called. When the doctor finally saw her, he listened to her chest with a stethoscope, his face growing more serious with each breath. He asked her questions. How long had she been coughing? Did she have night sweats? Had she lost weight? Margaret answered yes to everything. He ordered an X-ray. Margaret sat in a cold room while a machine hummed and clicked above her. Then she waited in the exam room, shivering in a paper gown. The doctor came back 20 minutes later, holding a film up to the light. He pointed to shadows on her lungs, dark spots that did not belong. "Mrs. Miller," he said gently, "I believe you have tuberculosis. We'll need to run more tests to confirm, but I'm fairly certain." Tuberculosis. The word hung in the air, heavy and frightening. "What does that mean?" Margaret asked, though she already knew. She had heard stories. People quarantined for months. People who never recovered. "It means you'll need treatment. Antibiotics, rest, isolation." And Mrs. Miller, he paused, choosing his words carefully. "You have a son, correct?" Margaret nodded. "Tuberculosis is highly contagious. You can't be around him right now. Not until we know you're no longer infectious." Margaret felt the last piece of her world crack and fall away. First David. Now Charlie. "How long?" she whispered. "It could be months. Maybe 6. Maybe longer." Margaret closed her eyes. She thought of Charlie's face that morning, the way he had hugged her before school. She thought of the promise she had made to David on their wedding day, to keep their family together no matter what. And now she was losing everything. The doctor scheduled her admission to St. Joseph Mercy Hospital in Ann Arbor, a facility with a tuberculosis ward. She had 3 days to make arrangements for Charlie. 3 days to say goodbye to her son. Margaret drove home in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The setting sun painted the sky orange and red, beautiful and cruel. She did not know how she would tell Charlie. She did not know how she would survive this. But she had no choice. She had to keep going. For him. For the son she was about to lose. The doctor's words echoed in Margaret's mind for 3 days straight. "Your son is at high risk. Tuberculosis spreads through the air, through coughs and sneezes. Children are especially vulnerable. You cannot be near him until you're no longer contagious. Do you understand?" She understood. She understood that the disease eating away at her lungs was now eating away at her life. She understood that she had no choice. She understood that keeping Charlie safe meant letting him go. The question was where? Margaret had no family left. Her parents were dead. Her only sister lived in California and had not spoken to her in years. David's parents were gone too, buried in the cemetery on the west side of town. The only option was David's younger sister, Evelyn. Evelyn Parker lived in Will County, Illinois, just outside Chicago. She was 31 years old, married to a man named Thomas who worked in insurance. They had 3 children of their own, all older than Charlie. Margaret had met Evelyn only a handful of times, mostly at Christmas and the occasional family gathering. They were not close. But Evelyn was family, and family was all Margaret had. She called Evelyn on a Thursday evening, her hands shaking as she dialed the number. The phone rang 4 times before someone picked up. "Hello, Evelyn, it's Margaret." There was a pause. Evelyn's voice came back cautious, uncertain. "Margaret, is everything all right?" Margaret took a breath. She had rehearsed this conversation in her head a dozen times, but now the words stuck in her throat. "No, everything is not all right." She explained it all. David's death, the tuberculosis, the need for isolation, the hospital in Ann Arbor where she would be admitted. And then the hardest part. "I need someone to take Charlie. Just for a few months. Until I'm better." The silence on the other end stretched long and heavy. Margaret closed her eyes and waited. Finally, Evelyn spoke. Of course we'll take him. Poor thing. He's been through so much already." Relief flooded through Margaret so fast it made her dizzy. She pressed her hand against the kitchen counter to steady herself. Thank you, Evelyn. "I don't know what I would have done." "It's what family does," Evelyn said. Her voice was kind but tired, as if she already regretted the decision. "When do you need us to come get him?" "As soon as possible. I'm being admitted to St. Joseph Mercy Hospital on Monday. We'll be there Sunday afternoon." They spoke for a few more minutes, working out the details. What Charlie would need. What school documents to bring. How to reach Margaret once she was in the hospital. When Evelyn hung up, Margaret stood in the kitchen holding the phone, tears streaming down her face. She had 3 days left with her son. She spent those days trying to memorize him. The way his hair stuck up in the morning no matter how much she smoothed it down. The gap in his smile where his front tooth was missing. The way he hummed while he colored. The sound of his laughter. The warmth of his hand in hers. She did not tell him everything. How could she? He was 7 years old. He had just lost his father. Telling him that his mother was sick, that she had to go away, that he would be living with people he barely knew, it felt like cruelty. But there was no other way. On Saturday night, she sat him down in the living room. The television was off. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Charlie sat on the couch, his legs too short to reach the floor. He looked at her with those wide brown eyes, so much like David's. "Charlie, baby, I need to talk to you about something important." His face grew serious. He had learned in the past month that important conversations meant bad news. "What is it, Mom?" Margaret knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. They were so small, so fragile. "I'm sick, sweetheart. The doctors say I need to go to a special hospital to get better." Charlie's eyes filled with tears immediately. "Are you going to die like Dad?" The question hit Margaret like a fist to the chest. She squeezed his hands tighter. "No, no, baby, I'm not going to die. I just need some medicine and some rest. But while I'm getting better, you're going to stay with your Aunt Evelyn and Uncle Thomas. Remember them?" Charlie nodded slowly, his lip trembling. "Do I have to go?" "Just for a little while. Until I'm all better. Then I'll come get you and we'll come home. I promise." Charlie's face crumpled. He threw his arms around her neck and buried his face in her shoulder. His whole body shook with sobs. Margaret held him tight, her own tears soaking into his hair. She whispered all the things mothers say when the world is falling apart. "It's going to be okay. I love you. I'll be back soon. We'll be together again." She did not know if any of it was true. Sunday afternoon arrived too fast. Evelyn and Thomas pulled up in a station wagon with wood paneling on the sides. Their 3 children sat in the back seat, staring out the windows with bored expressions. Evelyn stepped out first, smoothing her skirt. She was tall and thin with dark hair cut short. She looked like David, enough that it made Margaret's heart ache. "Margaret," Evelyn said, opening her arms. They hugged briefly, awkwardly. Thomas shook Margaret's hand and mumbled his condolences. The children stayed in the car. Margaret brought Charlie out to the porch. He carried a small suitcase she had packed with his clothes, his toothbrush, his favorite toy car. His eyes were red from crying. Evelyn knelt down in front of him, forcing a smile. "Hi, Charlie. You remember me? I'm your Aunt Evelyn." Charlie nodded but said nothing. "You're going to come stay with us for a while. We have a nice house and a big backyard. You'll like it." Charlie looked at Margaret, his face desperate. She knelt beside him and pulled him close. "Remember what I said, baby. I'm going to get better, and then I'm coming to get you. It won't be long." Charlie's voice came out small and broken. "You promise?" Margaret held out her pinky finger. It was something they had done since he was 3 years old, a sacred bond between them. Charlie hooked his pinky around hers, and they shook. "I promise," Margaret said. "I'll get better and I'll come back for you. I love you so much." "I love you too, Mommy." That word, Mommy. He had not called her that in over a year. It shattered what was left of Margaret's composure. She kissed his forehead, his cheeks, the top of his head. She breathed in the smell of him, trying to lock it into her memory. Then Evelyn took Charlie's hand and led him to the car. He climbed into the back seat, pressing his face against the window. Margaret stood on the porch and waved, smiling even as tears poured down her face. The car pulled away, and Charlie's small hand appeared in the window, waving back. Margaret stood there long after the car disappeared. She stood there until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Then she went inside the empty house and collapsed on the couch, sobbing into the cushions. The next morning, a neighbor drove her to Ann Arbor. St. Joseph Mercy Hospital was a sprawling brick building surrounded by trees. The tuberculosis ward was on the 3rd floor, a series of rooms with thick doors and windows that did not open. Margaret was led to a small room with a single bed, a nightstand, and a chair. The walls were pale green. The floor was linoleum. It smelled like bleach and medicine. A nurse gave her a hospital gown and told her to change. She would be starting treatment immediately. Antibiotics 4 times a day. Rest. Isolation. No visitors allowed except through the glass. Margaret changed into the gown and lay down on the bed. The sheets were rough and cold. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Charlie's face pressed against the car window. His small hand waving goodbye. His last smile, brave and heartbroken. Afternoon light slanted through the window, warm and golden. It fell across the bed in stripes, illuminating dust motes floating in the air. Outside, the trees were full and green. Birds sang. The world continued, indifferent to her suffering. Margaret turned her face to the window and let the sunlight touch her skin. She thought of Charlie playing in Evelyn's backyard, hoped he was eating, hoped he was safe. She thought of David, gone forever. She thought of the promise she had made with her pinky, a vow she prayed she could keep. The sunlight faded as the day wore on. Shadows crept across the floor, and Margaret lay alone in the hospital bed, separated from her son by miles and disease and the cruel hand of fate. This was her last family scene. The memory of spring light, the ghost of a child's smile, the weight of a promise that might never be fulfilled. The Parker house sat on the edge of Will County, Illinois, a 40-minute drive southwest of Chicago. It was an old two-story colonial with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and a rusted chain-link fence separated the property from the neighbors. Inside, the house smelled like old carpet and fried food. Charlie arrived on a Sunday evening in late May, clutching his small suitcase and looking lost. Evelyn showed him to a room on the second floor, barely larger than a closet. It had been used for storage until that afternoon. Boxes still lined one wall. The single bed had a thin mattress and sheets that smelled like mothballs. "You'll sleep here," Evelyn said, her voice flat. "Bathroom is down the hall. Dinner is at 6. Don't be late." Charlie nodded and set his suitcase on the floor. Evelyn left without another word, pulling the door closed behind her. Charlie sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. There were no posters on the walls, no toys, no warmth. The window looked out over the backyard, where a rusted swing set stood motionless in the fading light. He missed his mother. He missed his house. He missed the smell of coffee in the morning and the sound of his father's boots on the stairs. He missed everything about his old life, the life that had ended just a few weeks ago. Downstairs, he could hear voices. Evelyn's 3 children: Robert, 13 years old, Sarah, 11, and Daniel, 9. They had stared at Charlie when he arrived, their faces blank and unfriendly. No one had said hello. That first dinner was silent and uncomfortable. The family sat around a scratched wooden table in the kitchen. Thomas, Evelyn's husband, read the newspaper and said nothing. Evelyn served meatloaf and mashed potatoes with mechanical efficiency. The children ate quickly, their eyes darting to Charlie every few seconds. Charlie pushed his food around his plate. His stomach felt tight and small. He was not hungry. "Eat," Evelyn said sharply. "I don't waste food in this house." Charlie forced himself to take a few bites. The meatloaf was dry and tasteless. He chewed slowly, swallowing with effort. After dinner, the other children disappeared to their rooms. Charlie went upstairs and lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his mother in the hospital, alone in a room with green walls. He wondered if she was thinking about him too. The days blurred together. Evelyn enrolled Charlie in the local elementary school, a brick building 3 blocks from the house. He walked there alone every morning while the other children took the bus to the middle school. At school, Charlie sat in the back of the classroom and said nothing. The teacher asked him questions, but he only shrugged. The other kids ignored him. At the Parker house, things were worse. Robert and Daniel took pleasure in tormenting him. They called him names when Evelyn was not around. Orphan, charity case, mama's boy. They hid his things and laughed when he could not find them. Sarah said nothing, but she watched with cold eyes, as if Charlie's presence disgusted her. One evening in June, Charlie came downstairs for dinner and found his chair occupied. Daniel sat in it, smirking. "This is my seat now," Daniel said. Charlie stood there, confused. He looked at Evelyn, waiting for her to say something. She glanced at him, then at Daniel, then back to her cooking. "Sit somewhere else, Charlie," she said quietly. Charlie felt something crack inside his chest. He sat on the floor in the corner and ate his dinner there, his plate balanced on his knees. Robert and Daniel snickered. Thomas turned the page of his newspaper. After that, Charlie stopped expecting kindness. He stopped expecting anything at all. He began skipping meals. His stomach hurt all the time anyway. He grew thinner, his clothes hanging loose on his small frame. At school, he sat alone at lunch, staring at the table. The teachers noticed but said nothing. Quiet children were easy to overlook. Summer turned to fall. The leaves on the trees turned yellow and red, then brown. The air grew cold. Charlie's 8th birthday came and went without celebration. No cake, no candles. No one even mentioned it. In early October, Charlie stopped speaking entirely. He moved through the house like a ghost, silent and invisible. He did his chores when told. He went to school and came home. He ate when food was put in front of him. But inside, he was disappearing piece by piece. On a Tuesday morning in mid-October, Charlie woke before dawn. The house was still dark and quiet. He lay in bed and listened to the silence. Then he got up and got dressed. He put on his jacket and his shoes. He picked up his backpack, empty except for his father's photograph, the only thing he had left from home. He walked downstairs carefully, avoiding the steps that creaked. In the kitchen, Evelyn stood at the counter making coffee. She turned when she heard him. "You're up early," she said. Charlie looked at her. For a moment, he almost said something. Almost told her he could not stay here anymore. Almost asked if she had heard from his mother. But the words would not come. "I'm going to school," he said quietly. Evelyn nodded and turned back to the coffee pot. Charlie walked out the front door and into the cold October morning. He did not go to school. He walked past the school and kept going. He walked through neighborhoods he did not recognize. He walked until his feet hurt and his breath came in white clouds. He did not know where he was going. He only knew he could not go back. By the time Evelyn realized Charlie had not come home, it was nearly dark. She called the school and learned he had never arrived. Panic flickered in her chest. She called Thomas at work. She paced the kitchen, wringing her hands. "We have to call the police," Thomas said when he got home. Evelyn reached for the phone, then stopped. Her hand hovered over the receiver. What would she tell them? That she had taken in her nephew and lost him? That she had let him slip away? The police would ask questions. They would investigate. They would want to know about Margaret, about why Charlie was here in the first place. The next morning, Evelyn called a social worker she knew from church. The woman's voice was cautious and measured. "If you report the child missing, they'll investigate the whole situation. His mother is in isolation for tuberculosis, correct? The authorities might see that as child abandonment. They could press charges against her." Evelyn's stomach turned. "What should I do?" "Give it a few days. He's probably just run off. Kids do that when they're upset. He'll come back." But days passed, and Charlie did not come back. Evelyn could not eat, could not sleep. Guilt gnawed at her like a living thing. When Margaret called from the hospital 2 weeks later, her voice weak and hopeful, Evelyn made a choice. A terrible, cowardly choice. "How is he?" Margaret asked. "How is my Charlie?" Evelyn closed her eyes. The lie came easier than she expected. "He's fine. He's adjusting." There was a pause. "Can I talk to him?" "He's at school right now. I'll have him call you later." "Okay. Tell him I love him. Tell him I'm getting better." "I will," Evelyn whispered. When Margaret called again a week later, Evelyn let the phone ring. And when Margaret called the week after that, Evelyn answered and said the words that would haunt her forever. "Charlie doesn't want to talk to you. He's angry. He says you abandoned him." Margaret's sob echoed through the phone line. Evelyn hung up quickly, her hands shaking. She told herself it was for the best. That Margaret was too sick to handle the truth. That reporting Charlie missing now would only make everything worse. She told herself these lies until she almost believed them. But late at night, when the house was dark and silent, Evelyn lay awake and thought about the small boy with sad brown eyes who had walked out her door one October morning. And she wondered if she would ever be forgiven for what she had done. Margaret was released from St. Joseph Mercy Hospital in April of 1988. 6 months of treatment had cleared the tuberculosis from her lungs, but it had taken everything else from her. She had lost 20 pounds. Her hair had begun to gray. Her hands shook when she tried to hold a cup of coffee. The nurse who discharged her smiled and said she was lucky to be alive. Margaret nodded and said nothing. She did not feel lucky. She called Evelyn from a payphone outside the hospital. The phone rang 8 times before someone answered. "Hello?" It was Evelyn's voice, thin and strained. "It's Margaret. I'm out. I'm coming to get Charlie." The silence on the other end lasted too long. Margaret's heart began to pound. "Evelyn?" "Margaret, Evelyn's voice broke. "Charlie is gone." The world tilted. Margaret gripped the phone booth wall to keep from falling. "What do you mean, gone?" "He ran away. Back in October. I've been looking for him. I called the police. I called everyone. He just vanished." Margaret's knees buckled. She sank to the ground, the phone cord stretching taut above her. A scream built in her chest but came out as a whisper. "No, no, that's not possible." Evelyn was crying now, her words tumbling out in broken fragments. How Charlie had been unhappy. How he had walked out one morning and never came back. How she had searched and waited and hoped. Margaret hung up without saying goodbye. She sat on the cold concrete outside the phone booth and stared at nothing. Her husband was dead. Her son was missing. She had nothing left. But something inside her refused to break. Some deep reserve of strength, born from years of loss and survival, pushed her to her feet. If Charlie was out there, she would find him. She would search until her last breath. The next 3 years were a blur of highways and heartbreak. Margaret sold the house in Jackson and used the money to travel. She drove through Michigan, Illinois, and Ohio, stopping in every town, every shelter, every place a lost child might end up. She made flyers on cheap copy paper. Charlie's school photo stared out from 1,000 sheets. Missing Charlie Miller, age 7. Last seen October 1987. She stapled them to telephone poles and bulletin boards. She left stacks at grocery stores and gas stations. She handed them to strangers on street corners. Most people glanced at the flyer and shook their heads. Some offered sympathy. A few claimed to have seen him, but the leads always went nowhere. A boy in Detroit who was not Charlie. A child in Cleveland who looked similar but was someone else's son. Each false hope was a knife to the heart. Margaret contacted television stations and newspapers. A few ran stories. Local news segments featured her standing in front of Charlie's photograph, begging anyone with information to come forward. She appeared on a talk show in Chicago, her voice breaking as she described her missing son. Viewers called in with tips. None of them led anywhere. The money ran out eventually. Margaret found herself in Flint, Michigan, with $60 to her name and nowhere left to go. She rented a room above a laundromat and took a job washing dishes at a diner on the east side of town. The owner was an old man named Frank who chain smoked and spoke little. After 6 months, he offered to sell her the place. He was retiring, moving to Florida to live with his daughter. He would take payments, he said. Whatever she could afford. Margaret used the last of the insurance money as a down payment. In 1991, she became the owner of a small diner with cracked vinyl booths and a leaking roof. She renamed it Margie's Diner, painting the sign herself on a Saturday afternoon. The work was hard. She opened at 6 every morning and closed at 8 every night. She cooked, cleaned, served, and managed the books. Her hands grew rough and her back ached constantly. But the work kept her mind occupied. It gave her a reason to get out of bed. The diner became her life. Regular customers knew her by name. They knew she made good coffee and better pancakes. They did not know about Charlie, because Margaret never spoke of him to strangers anymore. The pity in their eyes had become unbearable. But she never stopped searching. On her one day off each week, she drove to nearby towns and put up new flyers. She called police departments and asked if there had been any updates. She checked missing children databases and scanned news articles for any mention of unidentified boys. Every year on March 21st, Charlie's birthday, Margaret closed the diner. She sat alone at the counter and lit a single candle on a cupcake. She sang happy birthday in a whisper and made a wish. Then she blew out the candle and threw the cupcake away. The first birthday, Charlie would have been 8, then 9, then 10. The numbers climbed higher each year. 15, 20, 25. Margaret watched other people's children grow up. She saw boys Charlie's age graduate from high school, go to college, get married. She wondered what Charlie would look like now, if he was even still alive. Evelyn came to visit every year in October, on the anniversary of Charlie's disappearance. She drove up from Illinois in her aging station wagon and sat in the diner booth by the window. She ordered coffee she did not drink and apologized for the 100th time. "I should have told you sooner," Evelyn said, her face hollow with guilt. "I should have called the police right away. I was so scared, Margaret. I thought they would blame you." "I know," Margaret said quietly. She refilled Evelyn's cup even though it was still full. "I know what you thought." The anger had faded over the years. What was the point of being angry? It would not bring Charlie back. Evelyn had made a terrible mistake, but she was suffering too. Margaret could see it in the lines around her eyes, the gray in her hair, the way her hands trembled when she spoke Charlie's name. In 1995, Evelyn told Margaret she had started volunteering at America's Missing Children Foundation, a non-profit organization that helped families search for lost children. She worked there 3 days a week, answering phones and organizing search efforts. "It doesn't bring him back," Evelyn said, staring into her coffee. "But maybe I can help someone else find their child." Margaret nodded. She understood. They were both trying to atone for sins they could not undo. The years continued their relentless march. The world changed around Margaret. Technology advanced. Cell phones became common. The internet spread. She learned to use a computer and created a website for Charlie. She posted his picture and information, hoping someone somewhere might recognize him. She joined online forums for parents of missing children. She read their stories and offered what comfort she could. Some of them found their children. Most did not. Margaret stayed in the forums anyway, a silent witness to other people's grief. In 2010, Charlie's 31st birthday, Margaret sat in the empty diner and realized she had been searching longer than she had been a mother. She had spent 23 years looking for a son she had only raised for 7. The arithmetic of loss was cruel and precise. She looked at herself in the mirror behind the counter. She was 62 years old. Her hair was completely gray. Her face was lined with decades of worry. She barely recognized herself. But she would not stop. Could not stop. As long as she had breath in her body, she would search. The diner kept her afloat financially, but just barely. She lived in the same small apartment above the laundromat, saving every spare dollar in case she needed it for the search. She drove an old Ford truck with rust heating through the wheel wells. She wore the same 5 outfits, rotating them week after week. None of it mattered. Material things were meaningless when your child was gone. By 2023, Margaret was 79 years old. Her body was failing. The cough had returned, different this time. Worse. The doctors found the cancer in her pancreas and gave her months to live. She closed Margie's diner for the last time in September. She gave the keys to Frank's daughter, who had moved back to Flint years ago. She packed what little she owned into 2 suitcases and drove to Cleveland, where a friend from the Missing Children forums had recommended an excellent cancer treatment center. She did not know if she would find Charlie. She did not know if he was even alive. But she knew she had tried. For 36 years, she had searched every road and knocked on every door. She had never stopped loving him. Never stopped hoping. And maybe, she thought as she checked into Cleveland Clinic, maybe that was enough. Maybe love itself was the point. Not the finding. Not the happy ending. Just the refusal to give up. She fell asleep that first night in the hospital thinking of Charlie's face. 7 years old. Gap-toothed and smiling. Forever young in her memory. And somewhere in the hospital, a doctor named Michael Parker was finishing his shift, completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. October turned to November. The trees outside Margaret's hospital window lost their leaves, branches becoming skeletal against the gray sky. Inside room 412, time moved differently. Hours stretched and compressed. Day and night blurred together in a haze of medication and pain. Margaret's condition worsened. The cancer was spreading faster than the doctors had predicted. She could no longer eat solid food. Her body was failing, shutting down system by system. The nurses increased her morphine drip. They spoke in soft voices, the tone people use around the dying. Through it all, Dr. Michael Parker remained her primary physician. He came every morning at 7:30 and every evening at 6. He checked her vitals, adjusted her medications, asked how she was feeling. His presence became the rhythm of her days. And every time he entered the room, Margaret felt that same strange flutter in her chest. Recognition without understanding. Familiarity without memory. She studied him obsessively. The way he tilted his head when listening. The small scar on his left cheek, barely visible in certain light. The way his hands moved when he explained medical terms, precise and gentle. The warmth in his brown eyes when he smiled. One morning, he sat beside her bed adjusting her foreline. His sleeve rolled up slightly, revealing his wrist. Margaret's breath caught. He wore a watch. An old silver Timex with a scratched face and a worn leather band. Her vision blurred with tears. David had worn the same watch. His father's watch. His grandfather's watch. The watch Charlie had loved to examine, asking if the hands were fighting. "Dr. Parker," she whispered. He looked up, concern crossing his face. "Are you in pain? Should I increase the dosage?" "No, She paused, her throat tight. "That watch. It's beautiful." He glanced at his wrist and smiled. "It was my grandfather's." "Well, the man I called my grandfather. He gave it to me when I turned 18. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to ask more. Wanted to demand answers. But the words caught in her throat. What could she say? "Are you my son? Did you used to be Charlie Miller?" It sounded insane even in her own mind. She closed her eyes and said nothing. That afternoon, Evelyn arrived. She had called 3 days earlier saying she was coming to visit. Margaret had tried to discourage her. The drive from Illinois was long, and there was nothing Evelyn could do. But Evelyn had insisted. She appeared in the doorway at 2 o'clock, carrying a bouquet of yellow carnations. She was 67 now, her dark hair gone completely gray. She looked older than her years, worn down by guilt and grief. "Margaret," she said softly, setting the flowers on the bedside table. "Evelyn." Margaret's voice was weak but warm. "You didn't have to come all this way." "Of course I did." Evelyn pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down. She took Margaret's hand, careful not to disturb the fourth line. "How are you feeling?" "Tired." "Always tired." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the window like fingertips. "I've been thinking about Charlie," Evelyn said quietly. "I think about him every day. Wonder where he is. If he's happy. If he thinks about us." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She squeezed Evelyn's hand. "Me too." Evelyn's face crumpled. She had carried the weight of Charlie's disappearance for 36 years, and it had never gotten lighter. If anything, the burden had grown heavier with time. "I should have done things differently," Evelyn whispered. "I should have." "Stop," Margaret said gently. "We've been over this 1,000 times. What's done is done." Evelyn nodded, wiping her eyes. She took a shaky breath and changed the subject. "How are the doctors treating you? Are they taking good care of you?" "Very good care. Especially my main doctor, Dr. Parker. He's wonderful." Something in Margaret's voice made Evelyn look up sharply. There was an odd quality to it. Wistful. Almost hopeful. "What is it?" Evelyn asked. Margaret hesitated. Then the words spilled out, rushed and uncertain. "He reminds me of Charlie." "Dr. Parker." "I know it sounds crazy. But his age, he must be 43 or 44. The same age Charlie would be now. And his eyes. They're brown, like David's. Like Charlie's. And the way he moves, the way he talks. Sometimes I look at him and I swear I see my son." Evelyn's breath caught. She stared at Margaret, her mind racing. "What's his first name?" "Michael." "Michael Parker." The room seemed to tilt. Evelyn gripped the armrest of the chair, her knuckles white. "Parker," she repeated slowly. "That's our name. My married name." Margaret's eyes widened. The connection had not occurred to her. She had been so lost in her own grief that she had not thought about the coincidence. "It's a common name," Margaret said, but her voice wavered. Evelyn stood abruptly, her face pale. "I need to make a phone call. I'll be right back." She left the room before Margaret could respond. Out in the hallway, Evelyn leaned against the wall, her heart pounding. Her mind raced through possibilities. Parker was not that common a name. And the timing. And the age. She pulled out her phone and called her husband, Thomas. "I need you to find something," she said when he answered. "Remember when Charlie disappeared? We never told Margaret this, but I found out later that a boy matching his description had been picked up by Child Services about 2 weeks after he ran away. They took him to St. Luke's orphanage in Chicago." Thomas was silent. "I need you to go there. Get the records from 1987. Look for any adoptions. Any boy named Michael or any variation. Any family named Parker." "Evelyn, what's going on?" "Just do it. Please." I think her voice broke. "I think I might have found him." She hung up and went back into Margaret's room. Margaret was watching her with wide, questioning eyes. "What is it?" Margaret asked. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said, sitting back down. "But I'm going to find out." Thomas called back 3 hours later. Evelyn answered on the first ring and stepped into the hallway again. Margaret watched through the window in the door, her heart in her throat. When Evelyn came back, her face was streaked with tears. She sank into the chair and took Margaret's hand in both of hers. "I found something," Evelyn whispered. "St. Luke's Orphanage in Chicago. October 1987. A boy was brought in by Child Services. No name, no identification. They called him Michael because he wouldn't speak, wouldn't tell them his real name. A couple adopted him 3 months later. Their last name was Parker. Robert and Ellen Parker." The room spun. Margaret could not breathe, could not think. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "Thomas is getting the full file." "But Margaret, the timeline matches. The age matches. The name. Everything." Margaret closed her eyes. Images flooded her mind. Charlie at 7 years old, walking out of Evelyn's house and disappearing into the October morning. A frightened child, alone and lost, picked up by strangers. Taken to an orphanage. Given a new name. A new life. A new family. And somehow, impossibly, he had become a doctor. He had become the man caring for her now. He had come back to her at the very end. "I need to see him," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "I need to know for sure." "We will," Evelyn promised. "But first we need to be certain. We need proof." She stood and walked to the door, looking out into the hallway. As if summoned, Dr. Michael Parker appeared, walking toward the room with a chart in his hands. Evelyn watched him approach. Watched the way he moved. The shape of his face. The color of his eyes. And she knew. Deep in her bones, she knew. That was Charlie. Her nephew. David's son. The boy she had lost 36 years ago. He had been here all along. Thomas arrived the next morning with a manila folder containing everything he had found. Evelyn met him in the hospital lobby, her hands shaking as she took the documents. Inside were photocopies of records from St. Luke's orphanage, intake forms, medical reports, adoption papers. A boy, approximately 7 or 8 years old, brought to the orphanage by Chicago Child Services on October 28, 1987. No identification. No family. He refused to speak for the first month. The staff called him Michael because they needed something to put on the paperwork. In January 1988, he was adopted by Robert and Ellen Parker, a childless couple from Evanston. The file included a photograph taken on adoption day. A small boy with dark hair and haunted eyes, standing between two smiling adults. Evelyn stared at the photograph until her vision blurred. It was Charlie. Older, thinner, sadder. But Charlie. What do we do? Thomas asked quietly. We tell him, Evelyn said. We tell them both. She went back to Margaret's room and showed her the documents. Margaret held the photograph with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. She traced the outline of the boy's face with one finger. My baby, she whispered. My Charlie. We need to talk to him, Evelyn said. But we need to do this carefully. We can't just burst into his life and destroy everything he knows. Margaret nodded, unable to speak. They decided to wait for Dr. Parker's evening rounds. Evelyn would approach him first. She would explain. She would confess. And then they would know for certain. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. Margaret lay in bed staring at the photograph, memorizing every detail. Evelyn sat in the chair beside her, her knee bouncing with nervous energy. Neither of them spoke. There were no words for what they were feeling. At 5:45, Evelyn stood. I'll wait in the hallway, she said. When he comes, I'll talk to him first. Prepare him. Evelyn, Margaret said, her voice barely audible. What if he hates us? What if he doesn't want to know? Evelyn's face crumpled, but she forced herself to stay strong. Then we'll accept that. But at least he'll know the truth. At least he'll know he was loved. She stepped out into the corridor and positioned herself near the nurse's station. From there, she could see the entire hallway. She watched the clock on the wall. 5:50, 5:55, 6 o'clock. At 6:03, Dr. Michael Parker appeared at the far end of the corridor. He walked with steady, unhurried steps, a tablet computer in one hand. He wore his white coat over blue scrubs. His stethoscope hung around his neck. Evelyn's breath caught. She studied his face as he approached. The shape of his jaw. The way his hair fell across his forehead. The set of his shoulders. And then she saw it. His eyebrows. They curved upward at the inner corners, creating an expression that was both serious and kind. They were exactly like Charlie's. Exactly like David's. The certainty hit her like a physical blow. This was him. This was her nephew. The boy she had failed. The child she had lost. Dr. Parker noticed her standing there and smiled politely. Good evening. Are you waiting for someone? Evelyn opened her mouth but no sound came out. Her legs felt weak. She reached out and steadied herself against the wall. His smile faded, replaced by concern. He stepped closer. Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need to sit down? Evelyn shook her head. Tears began to stream down her face. She could not stop them. Charlie, she whispered. Dr. Parker froze. His expression shifted from concern to confusion. I'm sorry, what did you say? Your name, Evelyn said, her voice breaking. It wasn't always Michael, was it? His face went pale. He took a step backward. I don't understand. Who are you? Evelyn's knees gave out. She sank to the floor, her hands pressed against the cold linoleum. The sobs came in great, wrenching waves. 36 years of guilt and grief poured out of her all at once. I'm so sorry, she gasped. I'm so sorry, Charlie. I lost you. I was scared and I lied. I told your mother you didn't want to talk to her. I told her you were angry. But you were just gone. You ran away and I didn't know what to do. I should have called the police right away. I should have told the truth. I'm so sorry. Dr. Parker stood frozen, his tablet hanging loosely in his hand. His face had gone completely white. His breathing was shallow and fast. I don't. He shook his head. I think you have me confused with someone else. Evelyn looked up at him through her tears. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph from the orphanage file. She held it up with a shaking hand. Is this you? St. Luke's Orphanage, Chicago, 1987. Dr. Parker stared at the photograph. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, as if trying to protect his heart. His eyes widened. Where did you get that? I'm Evelyn Parker. Your father's sister. David Miller's sister. You lived with me for 5 months in 1987. You were 7 years old. Your mother was in the hospital with tuberculosis, and you came to stay with us. And then you ran away, And her voice broke again. I failed you. I failed everyone. The tablet slipped from Dr. Parker's fingers and clattered to the floor. He pressed his back against the wall, his chest heaving. This isn't possible, he whispered. Your mother is here, Evelyn said. Margaret Miller. Room 412. She's dying. She's been looking for you for 36 years. Please, please, just talk to her. Dr. Parker's legs buckled. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. His whole body trembled. I don't remember, he said, his voice muffled. I don't remember anything before the orphanage. They told me I was found on the streets. That I had no family. You did have family, Evelyn said gently. You had a mother who loved you more than anything in the world. You had a father who died too soon. And you had me. And I let you down. Nurses and orderlies had gathered at a distance, watching but not interfering. One of them, an older woman with kind eyes, stepped forward. Dr. Parker, do you need medical assistance? He shook his head without looking up. Just give me a minute. They waited. Time seemed to suspend. Finally, Dr. Parker raised his head. His eyes were red, his face wet with tears. I need proof, he said. I need to know for certain. We can do a DNA test, Evelyn said. Margaret is willing. Are you? He nodded slowly. The test was arranged within the hour. Hospital policy required approval from the ethics board for such situations, but given the circumstances and Margaret's deteriorating condition, they expedited the process. A nurse came to Margaret's room and swabbed the inside of her cheek. Another nurse did the same for Dr. Parker in a private office down the hall. The samples were sent to the lab with a rush order. Results would take 24 hours. Margaret and Dr. Parker did not see each other that evening. He was not ready. She understood. Evelyn stayed with Margaret through the night, holding her hand, both of them silent and terrified and hopeful. The next evening, Dr. Parker returned to room 412. He stood in the doorway, a sealed envelope in his hand. His face was unreadable. Margaret sat propped up in bed, Evelyn beside her. They both stared at him. He stepped inside and closed the door. His hands shook as he opened the envelope and pulled out the document. He read it once. Then again. Then he looked up at Margaret. 99.9% probability, he said quietly. You're my mother. Margaret's face crumpled. She reached out with both hands, trembling and desperate. Dr. Parker, no. Charlie crossed the room in 3 steps and took her hands in his. Mom, he whispered. The word sounded strange in his mouth, unfamiliar after so many years. But it was right. It was true. Margaret pulled him close, wrapping her thin arms around him. He bent down and rested his head on her shoulder, and they both wept. 36 years of separation. 36 years of searching. And finally, they had found each other. Evelyn stood and quietly left the room, giving them privacy. She walked down the corridor with tears streaming down her face. But these were different tears. Not tears of guilt or grief. Tears of relief. After 36 years, she had made something right. The hospital counseling room was small and quiet, designed for difficult conversations. 3 chairs sat arranged in a circle near the window. A box of tissues rested on the small table in the center. The walls were painted a soft blue, meant to be calming, though nothing could calm the emotions in that room. Margaret sat in one chair, her body frail and thin beneath a borrowed cardigan. Evelyn sat to her right, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. And Michael sat across from them, still wearing his white coat, his face uncertain and guarded. A hospital counselor had offered to facilitate the meeting, but they had declined. This conversation needed to be private. Just the 3 of them. A family broken 36 years ago, trying to find a way to fit the pieces back together. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched heavy and uncomfortable. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him. Tried to reconcile the 7-year-old boy in her memory with this 43-year-old man. The gap-toothed smile was gone, replaced by a serious, professional demeanor. The messy hair was cut short and graying at the temples. But the eyes were the same. Brown and watchful and kind. Michael stared at his hands. He had barely slept the night before. His mind kept circling the same impossible truth. This dying woman was his mother. The life he remembered, the orphanage and the adoption and the years of not knowing where he came from, all of it had an answer now. But the answer brought as many questions as it solved. Evelyn broke the silence first. Her voice was hoarse, worn thin by crying. I need you both to understand what happened. All of it. No more secrets. She told the story from the beginning. How Charlie had arrived at her house, grieving and lost. How her own children had been cruel. How she had watched him withdraw, day by day, until he became a ghost. How he had walked out that October morning and never come back. And then the hardest part, the lies, the fear, the choice she had made to protect herself instead of protecting him. When your mother called from the hospital, Evelyn said, looking at Michael, I should have told her the truth. I should have said you were missing. But I was terrified. The social worker said they might charge Margaret with child abandonment. I thought I was protecting her. But really, I was protecting myself. Margaret reached over and took Evelyn's hand. She had heard this confession before, many times over the years. But Evelyn needed to say it again. Needed Michael to hear it. I told Margaret you were angry with her, Evelyn continued, her voice breaking. I said you didn't want to talk to her. And she believed me. For months, she thought you hated her. And all that time, you were out there somewhere, alone. Michael's jaw tightened. His hands clenched into fists on his knees. He was trying to process emotions he did not have words for. Anger, grief, confusion, relief. Margaret leaned forward, her thin frame trembling with the effort. Charlie, she said softly, then corrected herself. Michael, I need you to understand something. I didn't leave you because I wanted to. I didn't abandon you. Her voice grew stronger, more urgent. I was sick. Tuberculosis. It was killing me, and it could have killed you too. The doctors said I couldn't be near you. They said you would get infected. So I went to the hospital to get better, so I could come back and be your mother again. I never wanted to leave you. I was trying to save you. Tears streamed down her face. She gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. Every day I was in that hospital, I thought about you. I counted the days until I could hold you again. And when I got out and found out you were gone, her voice cracked. It destroyed me. But I never stopped looking. Never stopped hoping. For 36 years, I searched for you. Because you were my son. You are my son. And I love you. Michael's facade crumbled. His shoulders shook. He covered his face with his hands. The tears came hard and fast, years of buried pain rising to the surface. He had always felt incomplete. Even with his adoptive parents, who had loved him and raised him well, there had been a hole inside him. A darkness he could not explain. He had nightmares sometimes, fragmented images of a house he did not recognize, a woman's voice singing, the smell of coffee and toast. He had thought they were just dreams. Invented memories from a mind trying to fill in the blanks. But they were real. All of it was real. He lowered his hands and looked at Margaret. His voice came out rough and broken. I don't remember you. I've tried. Since yesterday, I've been trying so hard to remember. But it's all blank. Everything before the orphanage is just gone. Margaret nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I know. The counselor said that might happen. Trauma does that to children. The mind protects itself by forgetting. But I feel something, Michael said, pressing his hand to his chest. When I look at you, I feel something. Like an echo. Like I should know you. You'd know me, Margaret whispered. Somewhere deep inside, you know me. Michael was silent for a long time. He stared at the floor, his mind working through decades of confusion. Finally, he looked up at both women. I understand now, he said quietly. I understand what happened. Why it happened. It doesn't change the pain. It doesn't erase the years. But I understand. The weight in the room shifted. Not gone, but lighter. Forgiveness was not something that happened in an instant. It was a choice made over and over, day after day. But this was the beginning. Margaret held out her hand. Michael stood and crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair. She placed her hand on his cheek, her touch gentle and trembling. You became a doctor, she said, her voice filled with wonder. You help people. You save lives. I'm so proud of you. Michael closed his eyes and leaned into her touch. For the first time in 36 years, he felt found. The hospital ethics committee met the following day. Michael had submitted his request to remain on Margaret's care team as an assistant physician, with another doctor taking over as primary. There were concerns about objectivity, about emotional conflict. But given Margaret's terminal condition and limited time, they approved the arrangement. Michael moved Margaret to a private room with better light and a view of the hospital garden. He adjusted her pain management plan personally. He made sure she had everything she needed. And he visited her every day, sometimes twice a day. They talked. Not about the past at first, but about the present. He told her about his life, about medical school at Johns Hopkins, about his work in oncology, about the patients he had helped and the ones he had lost. And Margaret told him about Margie's diner, about the regulars who came in every morning for coffee, about the 36 birthdays she had celebrated alone, lighting candles and making wishes. Slowly, carefully, They built a bridge between who they had been and who they were now. One afternoon in late November, Michael brought his family to meet her. His wife Julia was a warm woman with red hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She worked as a teacher at a middle school in Cleveland Heights. She held Margaret's hand and told her how happy she was to finally meet her. And then there was Ethan, 6 years old, with dark hair and brown eyes that looked exactly like his father's. Exactly like Charlie's. The boy stood shyly at the foot of the bed, clutching his mother's hand. Michael knelt beside him. "Ethan, this is your grandmother." "My mom." Ethan's eyes went wide. He had heard the word grandmother before, but it had always referred to Julia's mother or his adoptive grandparents. This was different. This was new. Margaret's heart felt like it might burst. She had never thought she would have a grandchild. Had never imagined this moment. "Hi, Ethan," she said softly. "Hi," Ethan whispered back. Julia gently nudged him forward. Ethan walked slowly to the side of the bed. Margaret reached out and took his small hand. "You're very handsome," she said. "Just like your daddy was when he was your age." Ethan smiled, shy but pleased. Then, without prompting, he leaned forward and wrapped his arms around Margaret's neck in a careful hug. "I love you, Grandma," he said. The words hit Margaret like a wave. She held the boy close, breathing in the smell of his shampoo, feeling the warmth of his small body. Tears streamed down her face, but they were good tears. Healing tears. Michael stood beside Julia, his arm around her waist, watching his mother and his son. The family he thought he would never have. The connection he thought was lost forever. Evelyn stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. She had brought this family back together. It did not erase her mistakes, did not undo the pain, but it was something good and true and precious. The November light slanted through the window, warm and golden. Outside, the last leaves fell from the trees. Winter was coming. But inside room 412, there was warmth. There was love. There was family, complete at last. December brought snow to Cleveland. The hospital garden turned white and silent. Inside, Margaret's room remained warm and filled with quiet voices. She slept more now than she was awake. The cancer had spread to her liver, her bones, her brain. The doctors said it was a matter of days, not weeks. But she was not alone. Not anymore. Michael came every morning before his shift and every evening after. He sat beside her bed and held her hand. Sometimes he read to her from the newspaper. Sometimes he told her stories about his day. Sometimes he just sat in silence, watching her breathe. Julia visited too, bringing homemade soup that Margaret could no longer eat. She would sit on the other side of the bed and talk about her students, about the funny things they said, about the small dramas of middle school life. Margaret would smile, her eyes closed, listening. Ethan came twice a week. He would climb carefully onto the bed, mindful of the tubes and wires, and snuggle against his grandmother's side. He would tell her about school, about his friends, about the snowman he had built in the backyard. Margaret would stroke his hair with her thin fingers and whisper that she loved him. Evelyn stayed in Cleveland, taking a room at a hotel near the hospital. She came every afternoon and sat vigil. She knitted scarves she would never finish and drank cold coffee from paper cups. She was there when Margaret woke up confused, not knowing where she was. She was there when Margaret cried from the pain. She was there. The days blurred together. Christmas came and went. Michael brought a small tree to Margaret's room and decorated it with white lights. Ethan hung ornaments he had made at school. Margaret watched from her bed, too weak to do more than smile. On New Year's Eve, the whole family gathered in her room. They toasted with apple juice in plastic cups. They sang Auld Lang Syne quietly so as not to disturb the other patients. At midnight, Margaret was asleep, her breathing shallow and steady. Michael kissed her forehead and whispered Happy New Year. January passed in a fog of medication and fleeting moments of clarity. Margaret knew she was dying. She could feel her body shutting down, piece by piece. But she was not afraid. She had found her son. She had held her grandson. She had been forgiven and had forgiven. There was nothing left undone. On a cold morning in early February, Margaret woke before dawn. The room was dark except for the soft glow of the monitors. Michael was asleep in the chair beside her bed, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, his hand resting on the edge of her mattress. Margaret looked at him in the dim light. Her son. Her Charlie. She had missed so much of his life. His first day of school after the orphanage. His graduation. His wedding. The birth of his child. All those moments were gone, lost to time and circumstance. But she had this. These last few months. These precious days of knowing him, talking to him, loving him. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. And she was grateful. She tried to speak, to wake him, but her voice would not come. Her body was too tired. So she just looked at him and let herself feel the love that filled her chest, warm and whole. Julia was sleeping on the small couch by the window. Evelyn dozed in another chair, her knitting abandoned in her lap. And in the corner, curled up under a blanket, was Ethan. Michael had brought him after Ethan had begged to stay overnight with Grandma. They were all here. Her family. Her imperfect, broken, beautiful family. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself drift. She thought of David, young and strong, kissing her head before leaving for work. She thought of Charlie at 7 years old, asking if the watch hands were fighting. She thought of all the years of searching, the flyers and phone calls and sleepless nights. And she thought of forgiveness, of second chances, of love that endured even when everything else fell apart. The sky outside began to lighten, turning from black to deep blue to pale gray. The first birds started singing. A new day was beginning. Margaret took one last breath, deep and peaceful. And then she let it go. The monitor's steady beep changed to a long, continuous tone. Michael jerked awake instantly. He looked at his mother's still face and knew. "Mom," he whispered. He took her hand, already cooling. "Mom, no. Not yet." But it was time. They both knew it. Julia woke next, then Evelyn. They gathered around the bed, tears streaming down their faces. Ethan stirred under his blanket, confused and frightened by the adults crying. Michael lifted his son and held him close, trying to shield him from the pain. But Ethan understood. He was young, but he understood. "Grandma went to heaven," the boy said, his voice small. "Yes," Michael said, his voice breaking. "Yes, she did." They stayed with her for another hour. The nurses came and went quietly, respectful and kind. Eventually, they had to leave. The hospital needed to prepare the body. There were forms to sign, arrangements to make. Michael was the last to leave the room. He stood at the doorway and looked back at his mother one final time. She looked peaceful. The lines of pain that had marked her face for months were gone. She looked young again, almost. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for never giving up." The funeral was held on a Saturday in late February. The cemetery was on the outskirts of Cleveland, a peaceful place with old oak trees and rolling hills. The ground was frozen, covered in patches of snow. A small group gathered around the grave. Michael and Julia and Ethan, Evelyn and Thomas. A few of Margaret's old friends from Flint who had made the drive. Some nurses from the hospital who had grown fond of her. The service was simple. A minister said words about love and loss and reunion. Michael spoke briefly, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. He talked about his mother's strength, her determination, her love that had never wavered, even when the world tried to break her. They lowered the casket into the ground. Ethan threw a handful of dirt on top, his small face serious. One by one, the mourners left, until only Michael and Evelyn remained. They stood together in silence, looking at the grave marker. It was simple gray granite with words carved in clean letters. Margaret Miller. 1944-2024. 36 years of waiting, and love everlasting. Evelyn knelt and placed her hand on the cold stone. "I'm sorry I took so long to make this right," she whispered. "But you found him. You never stopped believing, and you found him. Rest now. Rest easy." Michael helped her to her feet. They walked together back to the car, their footprints dark in the thin snow. In the months that followed, Michael threw himself into work. But not just his medical practice. He had an idea. A way to honor his mother's memory and help others who were still searching. By summer, the Margaret Miller Foundation was officially registered as a nonprofit organization. Its mission was to assist families of missing children. It provided resources for search efforts, counseling services for families, and funding for investigative work. Michael served as director, working nights and weekends alongside his hospital duties. The foundation's first major project was partnering with America's Missing Children Foundation, the organization where Evelyn had volunteered for years. Together, they created a database that made it easier to connect missing children with their families. In the first year alone, the foundation helped reunite 12 families. 12 children found their way home. 12 mothers and fathers got to hold their sons and daughters again. Michael thought about his mother every time they made a match. He thought about the 36 years she had spent searching. And he made sure that no other parent would have to wait that long if he could help it. Every spring, on the first warm day when the forsythia blooms appeared, Evelyn made the drive to Cleveland. She brought yellow forsythia branches, bright and cheerful, full of life. She would stand at Margaret's grave and arrange the flowers in the small vase built into the headstone. Then she would kneel, her old knees protesting, and press her hand to the grass that had grown thick and green over the grave. "Hello, Margaret," she would say, her voice soft. "I brought your favorites." She would tell Margaret about the foundation, about the families they had helped, about Michael and Julia and Ethan, about how Ethan was growing so tall, so smart, so kind, about how he had his grandmother's determination and his grandfather's gentle heart. And then, as she did every year, she would whisper the same words. "You can rest now. You found him. You kept your promise. Rest easy." The wind would pick up, rustling through the oak trees overhead. The forsythia branches would sway in the vase, their yellow petals catching the sunlight. And Evelyn would sit there for a while longer, remembering the woman who had forgiven her, the boy she had lost, and the miracle that had brought them all back together. The story of Margaret Miller was a story of loss and love, of searching and finding, of 36 years of waiting that ended in 3 months of grace. It was a story of a mother who never gave up, a son who found his way home, a family that proved love could survive anything, even time itself. And as the forsythia leaves fluttered in the spring breeze, that love lived on. Do you believe love can truly outlive time, even death? Tell me what you would say if you met the one you lost in the comments below. And if this story touched you, please share it with friends or family. You never know who might need a little hope today. Thank you for being part of our journey today. This has been Story Theater.